For 3,700 years, it was the tallest structure on Earth, and for most of that time, we told completely the wrong story about who built it. The myth said slaves, 100,000 of them, beaten under a tyrant's whip. The evidence, buried right next to the pyramids and only excavated in the last 40 years, says something almost exactly opposite. The people who raised Khufu's pyramid were paid in beer and beef, operated under names like the Drunkards of Menkaure, and were buried as honored citizens beside the god-king they served. How we got the story so wrong, and what the truth reveals about the most sophisticated civilization the ancient world ever produced, is what this is about. If that sounds like your kind of story, hit like right now. Around 2560 BCE, Khufu, second pharaoh of Egypt's 4th dynasty, made a decision that would restructure an entire civilization. He did not simply commission a monument, he converted the whole Egyptian economy into a centralized redistribution network, funneling the agricultural surplus of an entire nation into a single, decades-long construction project. The pyramid he ordered was called Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu. His chief architects were his own blood relatives, viziers Hemiunu and Ankaf. The ambition was unlike anything the ancient world had attempted. But the question of who would actually do the building, that was still being answered. To understand what Khufu demanded, you need the numbers. 2.3 million stone blocks, average weight 2.5 tons each. The heaviest granite ceiling beams in the king's chamber, rose granite hauled from Aswan, hundreds of miles upstream, weighed 50 to 80 tons apiece. Total material, 6 million tons. Finished height, 146.6 meters, 481 feet. It would hold the record as the tallest human-made structure on Earth for over 3,700 years. The base was surveyed so precisely that the 4 sides vary by just 58 millimeters across the entire perimeter. That is not brute force. That is genius under pressure. And genius needs hands, a very specific kind of hands. In 449 BCE, more than 2,000 years after the pyramids were finished, a Greek traveler named Herodotus visited Egypt and wrote down what locals told him through translators. 100,000 men, 20 years, slaves driven to exhaustion. That story lodged itself in Western memory like a splinter, and later biblical associations welded it in place. For centuries, almost nobody questioned it. But Herodotus was a tourist, collecting legends in a foreign language 2 millennia after the fact. The real workforce was already buried, literally, right next to the pyramids. And in the 1980s, archaeologists finally started digging in the right place. Dr. Zahi Hawass changed the argument permanently. His excavations at Giza uncovered a workers' cemetery, not a mass grave, not a pit, but a prepared burial ground with individual tombs positioned in the direct shadow of the pharaoh's monument. That single detail was explosive. In ancient Egypt, burial near the pharaoh was a sacred honor, strictly denied to slaves. These were not disposable bodies. They were valued citizens. Hawass found skeletal evidence of advanced on-site medical care, flawlessly set broken bones, successful amputations for limbs crushed by falling masonry, and trepanation, brain surgery, where bone regrowth proved the patient lived for years afterward. The cemetery did not tell the story of a slave camp. It told the story of a workforce a state wanted to keep alive. At the same time, Dr. Mark Lehner and his team at Ancient Egypt Research Associates were mapping something extraordinary just south of the Sphinx. An entire city. They called it Hayt el Garab, the lost city of the pyramid builders. Bakeries, barracks, administrative buildings. Lehner's excavations revealed a standing permanent workforce of roughly 10,000 skilled professionals, swelling to perhaps 30 to 40,000 seasonal laborers during the annual Nile flood, the one season when farming was impossible anyway. The state did not conscript slaves. It employed its own idle population during the flood months, and it fed them extraordinarily well. How well? That answer was buried in bone. Dr. Richard Redding, AERA's chief research officer, spent years analyzing food remains at Hayt el Garab, over 175,000 animal bones. What he found shattered the image of starving, brutalized laborers. The workforce was consuming up to 4,000 pounds of meat every single day. Cattle went to overseers. Sheep and goat went to standard laborers, a tiered salary structure, written in bone. This was a state-sponsored catering operation of staggering scale, drawing on an agricultural footprint that stretched across 465 square miles of Egyptian farmland. These workers were not surviving. They were being systematically fueled for precision work. And they had something else no slave force ever had: an identity. We do not just have bones, we have words. In the workers' cemetery at Giza, excavators found the tomb of an Old Kingdom official named Kai. On its walls, in hieroglyphs, Kai recorded his relationship with his craftsmen in terms no slave master would ever use. His inscription reads, "I paid them beer and bread. I made them to make an oath that they were satisfied." That is not a command. That is a contract. And it came with a workforce culture to match. The laborers were divided into competing teams called Phyles, maritime gangs with names that tell you everything about their spirit. The Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaure. These were not broken men. They were organized, competitive, and proud. They had hierarchy, identity, and, if the medical evidence is any guide, a state that genuinely wanted them alive and productive. But moving 2.3 million blocks still required something nobody had fully understood until a sealed cave on the Red Sea coast was opened in 2013. In 2013, archaeologists excavating a Red Sea harbor called Wadi al-Jarf pulled something out of a sealed cave: papyrus scrolls. The oldest known papyrus documents ever found anywhere on Earth. They belonged to a middle-ranking official named Inspector Merer, who commanded a 40-man file called the Escort Team of the Uraeus of Khufu as its prow. Day by day, Merer logged his work. One entry reads, "Merer spends the day with his file loading a transport ship at Tura North. Sets sail from Tura in the afternoon." White limestone casing stones, not dragged across the desert, but floated by water. And the logs confirmed construction stretched into Khufu's 27th regnal year, far beyond Herodotus' tidy 20. The whole logistics picture had to be redrawn. Merer's diary forced a complete rethink of how the pyramids were built. Forget the image of thousands of men hauling blocks through open desert. The 4th Dynasty builders engineered a deep artificial harbor basin called Roche Khufu and a network of sluice gates connecting directly to the Nile During the annual flood season, transport barges could float multi-ton limestone blocks almost all the way to the foot of the Giza Plateau, bypassing overland friction almost entirely. Sediment core analyses confirmed the harbor existed. The pyramids were not just a construction project. They were a maritime logistics operation. And the stone they moved was heavier than almost anyone realizes. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone. The heaviest stone blocks at Giza are not in Khufu's pyramid. They are in the mortuary temple of Menkaure, the smallest of the three main pyramids. The foundation blocks there weigh between 200 and 220 tons each. Khufu's famous granite ceiling beams in the King's Chamber top out at 80 tons. Menkaure's builders quarried, transported, and placed blocks more than twice as heavy. Khafre, meanwhile, built his pyramid at a steeper angle, 53 degrees in 8 minutes, and integrated the Great Sphinx into his complex. Each pharaoh pushed the limits further, but the civilization doing the pushing had a medical sophistication that would not be discovered until a Cambridge laboratory examined two very old skulls. In May 2024, paleopathologist Edgard Camaros of the University of Santiago de Compostela and Tatiana Tondini of the University of Tübingen published an analysis of two ancient skulls held at Cambridge University's Duckworth Laboratory. Skull 236, belonging to a man aged 30 to 35, dating to between 2687 and 2345 BCE, showed a primary tumor and over 30 metastatic lesions consistent with nasopharyngeal carcinoma. Under a microscope, they found perimortem cut marks around the lesions, made by a sharp metal instrument. Ancient Egyptian physicians were attempting to surgically excise cancer. Camaros stated, "What we found is the first evidence of a surgical intervention directly related to cancer. This is where modern medicine starts." The people who built the pyramids were also inventing oncology. Science also tried to date the pyramids directly. In 1984, and again in 1995, researchers ran carbon-14 tests on mortar samples from the pyramid walls. The results came back an average of 374 years older than expected, which briefly gave ammunition to fringe theorists. But the explanation was mundane and revealing. Ancient Egypt had almost no timber. Builders recycled centuries-old wood as fuel to burn limestone and gypsum into mortar. The radiocarbon dated the old wood, not the moment the mortar was mixed. It was not a mystery. It was a recycling economy. Every thread of evidence kept pointing to the same conclusion. This was a sophisticated, organized, humane civilization, not a slave empire. So what would it cost to replicate it today? Modern economic analyses put the cost of replicating the Great Pyramid today, using manual labor and ancient techniques, at upward of $5 billion. With modern earth movers and transportation, the estimate drops to between $1 and $1.14 billion. And that covers only the construction itself, not the harbor system, not the supply chains spanning hundreds of miles, not the bakeries feeding 40,000 people, not the medical infrastructure keeping them alive and working. Khufu did not just build a pyramid. He ran the ancient world's most complex logistical enterprise, staffed with free citizens who were paid, fed, healed, and buried with honor beside the monument they raised. Which brings us back to where we started. Here is the contradiction we opened with. How could the tallest structure on Earth stand for 3,700 years, and we still got the story of who built it completely wrong? Because the myth of the slave was simpler than the truth of the citizen. The Great Pyramids were not a monument to tyranny. They were a monument to organization, to a state that turned an annual flood into a national stimulus, that paid its workers in beer and beef, that performed brain surgery on construction workers and attempted to cut out cancer 4,000 years before oncology had a name, and that let its builders rest in tombs beside a god king. The real builders of Giza were not slaves. They were the most sophisticated workforce the ancient world had ever assembled. And the evidence was under the sand the entire time. If you want more untold stories like this one, subscribe.